All right, what's going on, everyone? So, a little good news, bad news. Good news, as of now, it looks like Iran and Israel managed to not pull the entire world into a global conflict. Bad news, that little tit for tat last week made it more likely than ever that those two countries are headed towards a full-scale military conflict. Now, the Iranian strike into Israel signaled a major change in their policy. It appears to show that some hawks within the IRGC and senior levels of the Iranian leadership are willing now to take on a large military confrontation with Israel and possibly the United States. That doesn't mean they want it, but they might not be trying to avoid it as much as they have been in the past. And that's a problem. So we're going to talk today about some history of this conflict between Israel and Iran to kind of build up to where we are today. The Iranian strategy prior to April 1st and why I think it was largely working, and what this new norm inside of Iranian policy might mean going forward. Now, first and foremost, I think it's worth dispelling the rumor that I still see circulating that this Iranian attack was not designed to inflict any sort of damage on Israel. It was really just a message. I would agree that it came with a message, but that message was that Iran is now open to direct military confrontation with Israel. Again, that's a problem that we're heading in that direction. So what I've seen a lot of folks point to is the fact that this attack was designed to show Iran's strength and self-control in some sense. I'm not entirely sure how we get there. Some of that points to the fact that so few munitions got through to actual Israeli territory and that the attack wasn't designed to cause any significant damage inside of Israel. Now, I'll give you this. It does look like, from what we've seen, that Iran was targeting Israeli military infrastructure. And it looks like that was done in order to prevent any sort of further escalation from Israel. Kind of continue to fight within these bounds. It's hard to say for sure because the majority of these munitions didn't actually make it to Israel, let alone through Israel's air defense. But those that did make it through appear to have been targeting military infrastructure. That is one way to kind of limit the possibility of further escalation. But the idea that any country is going to plan on another nation shooting down like 99% of missiles and drones, it's not realistic. You can't plan for that. It also, there's a lot of reporting coming out right now from the United States, I should say, that as many as half of the missiles that were fired from Iran either failed at launch or crashed before reaching Israeli airspace. That's not something you plan for. A modern military doesn't take some of their missiles and drones, even ones that are older and maybe been in storage for a while, as is speculated here, and say this attack, it might look like 330 munitions. It's only going to be like 20 that actually get to Israel because so many are going to fail. That's not a good look for Iran. It's not a message that you want to send. The overall takeaway from this attack at this point appears to be that Iran looks weaker, less competent, that so few of these munitions in a significant attack were able to make it all the way through to Israel, and the Israeli air defense and their allies in the region, their willingness to step up, looks stronger than it did prior to. So big picture here, this was intended to be a significant attack. And again, the major takeaway is not necessarily what the direct outcome of the strike was going to be. Again, looks like military targets, but that Iran made that jump at all to direct military confrontation. Now, it's worth getting into some of the history of this shadow war, if you will, between Iran and Israel, because it's nothing new. I mean, this attack, the Iranian attack on Israel last week, was described as retaliatory, and that's how Iran presented it, which it was. And that they point to one specific event and say we are doing this because of the April 1st attack in Damascus that killed 7 IRGC officials, including a couple pretty senior officers within that organization. But it's worth mentioning these Israeli attacks in Syria, it's nothing new. So when you see people point to the Iranian response to April 1st and say they had to do it because of that, this has been going on for a long time, 10 plus years. So Israel has struck IRGC positions in Syria hundreds of times before this most recent event. That campaign, which has largely been waged since 2013, the idea there from Israel's perspective is to try to kind of prevent the IRGC from cementing any sort of significant military presence in Syria, possibly, hopefully, disrupting the flow of weapons then from Iran to Hezbollah and a variety of other militant groups across the region. In turn, Syria, for about 10 years now, has kind of been the front line in this undeclared shadow war between Iran and Israel. These strikes are pretty regular. Then continuing with the Israeli strikes, Israeli offensive operations against Iran, you have to look at sabotage. There's been multiple attacks conducted likely by Israel's Mossad that have included bombings inside of Iran's nuclear facilities, their military facilities, and assassinations of high-level officials, military officers, and scientists. It's nothing new. And each one of these, every time this happens, it's kind of a poke in Iran's eye. I mean, it's embarrassing because it's overt. You can see the results of these operations, and it shows that Iran, time and again, is not able to necessarily buckle up their security in a way that's so tight that prevents Israel from regularly penetrating and conducting these types of attacks. And it's kind of built on itself. Over time, each attack gets worse and worse for Iran in terms of public perception, not just domestically, but internationally. Because of the way that Iran has chosen to wage this war with Israel, what we see is that Israel, although never officially confirmed by Israel, is carrying out these multiple attacks against targets in Syria and then these covert attacks inside of Iran. And then what we see, it looks like Iran's not doing anything, right? Because they're not directly attacking Israel back. But that's not the entire picture. That kind of makes it look like Israel has the upper hand through and through, is constantly winning this fight. There's more to it than that, which leads into the Iranian strategy and what they've been going for this whole time. So the Iranian way of waging this war, if you will, has kind of been through funding, supplying, and then training proxy forces in the region. Shouldn't be a major surprise to anyone. We're talking about Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and a myriad of groups across Iraq and Syria. The goal here, largely, has been to create this dispersed group of semi-autonomous organizations that are aligned with Iranian geopolitical goals. So it's the type of unconventional battlefield is what they're creating that has been very challenging for us in the United States and Israel, in this case, to clearly win. And it allows Iran to continually attack Israel, albeit through these proxies. So again, we're seeing these direct Israeli attacks on Iran, kind of a poke in Iran's eye over and over and over again. Iran's response to that, they were doing something every single day. They were doing something, but it was through their proxies across the region. It might be direct attacks against Israel. It might be funding, equipping, or training them to make them stronger and stronger as time goes on. That's not as much overt. There's some vagueness to how much autonomy those groups have and how much direction are they taking from Iran. So again, shadow war, nice and confusing. So overall, the Iranian strategy here is to try to embroil Israel in constant conflict or a fear of a conflict right on their borders. Honestly, it was largely working. I mean, not just prior to October 7th, but certainly since. I mean, if you look at the Hamas attack on October 7th into Israeli territory, it kind of highlights the relative success of this overall plan. A key term here that's regularly used, talking about Iranian strategy, is strategic patience. We'll come back to that more here in a second. Now, following the October 7th attack from Hamas into Israel, the Israeli war that the war that Israel has waged in Gaza has kind of shown the massive challenges that they face in trying to combat what Iran has put together. So defeating an insurgent force, not easy, challenging. Of course, we've seen that firsthand here in the United States. That fight against Hamas is very much still underway in Gaza. That entity is still there, still lethal. It also showed that as Israel continued to carry out this war in Gaza, the way that they were conducting that war turned a lot of international opinion against Israel and in favor of the Palestinians, or at least more than it did before October 7th, right? All of those together are kind of wins for Iran. They're seeing Israel continue to get embroiled in more and more conflicts, more significant wars in Gaza, in Lebanon. Now they're dealing with more on the Syrian border. The Houthis are occasionally launching missiles and drones at Israeli territory. And meanwhile, international sentiment is kind of not necessarily turning in favor of Iran, not by a long shot, but turning against Israel. Again, strategic patience. This is working, was working in Iran's favor. That strategic patience idea, to dig a little bit more into that, is essentially the idea that so long as Iran can handle these minor setbacks, these minor losses, they have the possibility of winning in the long term. So these minor losses are things like their equipment being destroyed when it's shipped to militias or allied groups in Syria, to proxy forces being killed, some of their senior leaders being killed, and then IRGC officials being targeted and killed in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, or elsewhere. All of those are significant to a degree, but in the grand scope of this larger shadow war between Iran and Israel, they're relatively minor. So again, strategic patience. So long as Iran can handle those and continue the fight, they have the possibility of winning this eventual war with Israel in the long term. But then Israel's attack into Damascus on April 1st forced Tehran to make a decision. They could hold back, refrain from any sort of overt retaliation, and continue to benefit from this kind of current status quo. Again, personal opinion, it seems like a lot of the winds were flowing in Iran's direction. Their proxies around the world, across the Middle East, were stronger now than they've ever been, minus Hamas, who has their own challenges they're kind of dealing with right now. And a lot of public sentiment was turning against Israel. Iran could have just kind of leveraged that and let it ride, again, strategic patience. Or they could decide to respond with force and try to reset this status quo between the two, which, neither one of these are perfect solutions. They both come with risks. And one of those risks that I've seen articulated recently is that there is some sort of Israeli trap trying to draw Iran out of this shadow war into a more conventional fight. The reason for that is if you look at measuring the capabilities, the strength of these two nations, Israel has a clear upper hand comparatively in the conventional realm, whereas Iran has a clear upper hand comparatively in the unconventional realm. And it's, again, arguably a war that they have been winning on their own terms. I'm not sure I buy that entirely, that this specific strike on April 1st was an Israeli trap, but it's possible, keep it in consideration, that has been a long-term Israeli strategy to try to draw Iran, again, out of the shadows and force them into doing something that forces them into the conventional realm of fighting this war. So as we know now, the decision was made by Tehran to overtly strike inside of Israel. They claimed responsibility for it. They said it was coming. They announced that it was going to take place. They warned their partners in the region. And while those missiles and drones were inbound, they even signaled and said, hey, by the way, that's going to do it. That was us. This is why we did it. And that's the end of this response. Now, while the messaging was all there ahead of time, so it wasn't necessarily a surprise attack, we can't downplay just how out of the ordinary this really was. So the Israeli response, for what it's worth, we should cover this as well, was pretty expected. If you look at it from Israel's point of view, they were on the receiving end of 300 plus drones and missiles fired from Iranian territory to Israeli territory. And Israel, in turn, what it looks like now, is that they struck air defense sites inside of Iran with conventional military munitions. Take the names of the countries out of it, that's kind of what you expect, right? Israel kind of continued on with how they tend to fight this war by not claiming responsibility for that strike. But receiving a strike on your own territory and then striking the country that carried that out is kind of to be expected around the world. That's more understandable. The Iranian change here is significantly different. And that could be because this attack in Damascus was quite a bit different, right? I mean, Israel has been striking Iranian targets in Syria for years now, but this attack in Damascus was against an Iranian consulate building and killed very senior IRGC personnel. That said, Iran has never even launched a single attack from their territory into Israel. So it's a noticeable jump to go from nothing to 330 plus drones and munitions in the very first wave. You see where that big change comes, right? The messaging here could have been 1 missile, 10 missiles, 20 missiles, right? You could keep going up and up and up. Instead, Iran opted, in this case, for a strike that isn't all that out of the ordinary for this shadow war between the two nations, to respond with 330 drones and missiles fired into Israeli territory. That is a significant change from how this war has played out in the past, which points to a pretty serious change in the mindset of Tehran, that arguably some of the more hawkish members of the IRGC are more interested or less concerned about an open war, conventional war with Iran and maybe even the United States. Again, I want to stress this doesn't mean that they are trying to enter that war, but maybe the guardrails of trying to prevent that are no longer there, that were kind of keeping this war in the shadows for the last couple decades. Now, you can see from some of these talking points from Iran, as soon as this attack took place, right before, during, and after, they were providing off-ramps to Israel. So again, I want to stress, I don't think this is Iran saying, we're ready to fight this war with Israel, we want to do this right now. There are a lot of reasons why neither one of those two countries would benefit from a full-scale war with one another. And we did see Iran offer some off-ramps, right? They talked about, again, they didn't target any civilian infrastructure from what we can tell right now. While the attack was ongoing, they said this is going to be it. And they even after the Israeli attack back into Iranian territory just a couple days ago, what have we seen from the Iranian government officials? They've downplayed that attack and said, we're not going to retaliate. So again, this doesn't appear to be that Iran is running into war and wanting to start a war with Israel. It's just, As we move up this escalation ladder, you have to think of it a few ways. You get the, mean public messages, right? Maybe some diplomacy going on, maybe public condemnation of another country. Eventually you move into the covert realm. That's where this Iran-Israel war has been for a long time now. Once you move out of covert into overt military action, it just clears the stage for what comes next, right? What's the follow-on operation here? Now that missiles and drones are part of the status quo in how Israel and Iran fights, what's next? Another missile and drone attack? How many of these have to take place? What happens when more of these get through? It has just opened up a new chapter in this war that cannot be understated. And the reason for that is even if the recent tensions completely dial down, and maybe we don't see a significant response from Iran like they promised, and maybe Israel doesn't directly attack Iran anytime in the near future, even if these current sets of tensions die down, the underlying issues between Iran and Israel are nowhere near resolved. No more resolved today than they were a month ago. So that tension is still there. All we've done by these overt military attacks carried out by Iran into Israeli territory is up the ante and made conventional military strikes more of a norm in this shadow war than it's ever been, which again leads to the increased likelihood that a full-scale war between Iran and Israel is much more likely today than it has ever been in either country's history. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. Substack's like a mix between a newsletter and a website. I publish these videos there. They're ad-free, sponsor-free. And then we got a bunch of free articles covering a variety of subjects from South America, Asia, Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, and more. So again, if interested, linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.